When your father bets $2.3 million that you'll fail Navy SEAL training, there are two ways to prove him wrong. You can argue with him, or you can stay silent for 2 years, earn the rank to seize his yacht, and let the Coast Guard deliver your response on his birthday. The morning sun glinted off San Diego Bay as I stood on the observation deck of the Naval Special Warfare Command, watching through binoculars as 3 Coast Guard vessels approached my father's pride and joy. The 80-foot yacht Semper Fi bobbed peacefully in the marina, decorated with red, white, and blue balloons for Captain Rex Blackwood's 60th birthday celebration. I could see him clearly through the yacht's panoramic windows, holding court with his usual crowd of retired Marine buddies, their wives clutching champagne flutes and laughing at his war stories. My mother Elena moved gracefully between guests, playing the perfect hostess role she'd mastered during 25 years as a military spouse. The scene looked like something from a luxury lifestyle magazine, successful people celebrating a successful man's milestone birthday aboard his floating palace. But I knew something they didn't. The lead Coast Guard cutter's loudspeaker crackled to life, its voice carrying across the water with military authority. This is the United States Coast Guard. Captain Blackwood, prepare for immediate boarding. All guests must disembark immediately. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? Through my binoculars, I watched my father's face transform from confusion to outrage in real time. He stormed onto the yacht's deck, his dress blues from his Marine Corps days making him look every inch the commanding officer he once was. Rex Blackwood had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. What the hell is this about? He bellowed across the water, his voice carrying the same tone that had intimidated me for 32 years. This is private property. You have no authority here. The Coast Guard boarding team moved with practiced efficiency, completely unfazed by his bluster. I could see Uncle Tom, Dad's younger brother, frantically making phone calls while the other guests clustered together in nervous confusion. Mom stood frozen on the deck, her perfectly styled hair whipping in the bay breeze, clutching her pearls like they might anchor her to reality. The lead Coast Guard officer stepped forward with an official document, his voice professional but firm. Sir, this vessel is being seized under federal authority. Please review this notice. I didn't need binoculars to see my father's hands shaking as he read the seizure order. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could practically feel his blood pressure spiking. The document was brief but devastating. Admiral's orders. This vessel, now property of Naval Special Warfare, to be used for training exercises and target practice. The guests began abandoning ship like rats, scrambling onto the Coast Guard vessels and smaller boats that had appeared to ferry them to shore. My mother was arguing with the officers, probably threatening lawsuits and demanding to speak to their superior. Dad stood rigid on the deck, staring at the seizure notice like it might change if he read it enough times. But it was the final line of the document that made this moment perfect. In smaller print, almost like an afterthought, it read, "Seizure authorized by Lieutenant Commander A. Blackwood, Naval Special Warfare Command." 5 years ago, my father had stood in front of our entire extended family and declared with absolute certainty, "The Navy will kick you out, Aria. Women don't belong in special operations. You'll wash out in 6 months, and I'll bet my life savings on it." Today, the Navy was taking his life savings. Not because I'd washed out, but because I'd risen high enough to have the authority to authorize the seizure of his most prized possession. The yacht he'd named Semper Fi in honor of his Marine Corps service was about to become target practice for the Navy SEALs he'd claimed would never accept me. I lowered my binoculars and smiled. Sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about proving that the person who bet against you fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. The Coast Guard vessels disappeared around the point, taking the Semper Fi toward its new purpose as a training aid. My father's 60th birthday celebration had just become the opening act of a story that began 5 years earlier with 3 simple words: "The Navy will kick you out." He was wrong about a lot of things. But he was right about one thing: this was definitely going to be a birthday he'd never forget. 5 years earlier, I sat at the head of our dining room table, looking around at faces I'd known my entire life. The mahogany table that had hosted countless military promotion celebrations, retirement parties, and holiday gatherings was set with Mom's finest china, the good stuff she only brought out for special occasions. Tonight felt special to me. I'd just received my acceptance letter to Navy SEAL training, and I thought my family would be proud. How wrong I was. You want to do what? Dad's fork clattered against his plate, the sound echoing through our formal dining room like a gunshot. Uncle Tom stopped mid-chew, his wife Sarah nearly choked on her wine, and my cousins Marcus and Lisa looked between us like they were watching a tennis match. Navy SEAL training, Dad. I got accepted. They said my scores were among the highest they'd seen, and absolutely not. His voice carried that tone I remembered from childhood, the one that ended discussions before they could begin. Arya, you're not thinking clearly. This isn't some game. This is the real military with real consequences. I felt my cheeks burning as 23 relatives and family friends turned their attention to our conversation. The Blackwood family gatherings were legendary in our San Diego military community. Dad's Marine Corps buddies, their wives, kids, grandkids, everyone came to witness Captain Rex Blackwood hold court in his domain. Rex is right, honey. Mom's voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she'd used when explaining why I couldn't have a pony or stay up past bedtime. Women in special operations is still very experimental. You could get seriously hurt, and for what? To prove a point. To serve my country, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The same way you did, Dad. The same way Uncle Tom did. The same way half the people at this table did. Dad's face turned the particular shade of red I recognized from his most explosive moments. He stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow across the table. Every conversation in the room stopped. Let me explain something to you, little girl. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been yelling. The Marine Corps made me the man I am today. 18 years of service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars. I know what real military service looks like. He gestured around the table with theatrical flair, ensuring everyone was paying attention. The Navy SEAL program is the most elite fighting force in the world. It breaks grown men, experienced soldiers, into pieces. What makes you think a 27-year-old woman who's never even been camping can survive what destroys Marines? Uncle Tom nodded in agreement. Rex has a point, Arya. Maybe start with something more realistic. The Air Force has some nice desk jobs. The laughter that rippled around the table felt like being slapped. These people had watched me grow up, cheered at my college graduation, celebrated my achievements. Now they were laughing at my dreams. You know what? Dad's voice rose as he warmed his theme. I'm so confident you'll wash out. I'll make this interesting. He turned to Uncle Tom with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Tom, you want to make a little wager? Rex, don't do this, Mom whispered, but he was already committed to the performance. I'll bet my entire life savings, every penny I've saved for retirement, that Arya won't last 6 months in SEAL training. Hell, I'll bet she doesn't even make it to Hell Week. The room went dead silent. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. A grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. Uncle Tom's eyes went wide. Dad, you don't need to. $2.3 million, he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. That's how confident I am that my daughter is about to embarrass herself and this family. Tom, you want to take that bet? Uncle Tom shifted uncomfortably. Rex, maybe we should. What's wrong? Not confident in your niece. Dad's smile was razor sharp. Anyone else want to bet on Arya making it through SEAL training? Anyone? The silence stretched until it became unbearable. 23 people stared at their plates, unwilling to meet my eyes. These were my people, my family, my support system. And not one of them believed in me enough to even pretend they thought I could succeed. Fine, I said quietly, standing up from the table. I guess I'll have to prove you wrong. You can't prove me wrong because I'm not wrong, Dad called after me as I headed for the door. The Navy will kick you out, Arya. It's not personal, it's just reality. Women don't belong in special operations, and you're going to learn that the hard way. I walked out of that house knowing I'd never be welcome at another family gathering unless I came back with my tail between my legs, ready to admit he was right. The last thing I heard before the door closed was him explaining to the remaining guests why sometimes fathers have to be cruel to be kind. What he didn't know was that he'd just given me the most powerful motivation I'd ever had, proving that Captain Rex Blackwood could be spectacularly, expensively wrong. But that dinner wasn't the first time my father had sabotaged my military dreams. It was just the first time he'd done it publicly. The real betrayal had happened 9 years earlier, when I was 18 and naive enough to believe that parents always wanted what was best for their children. I'd spent my senior year of high school obsessing over my West Point application, staying up until midnight perfecting essays, running extra miles every morning to improve my fitness scores, and studying for the SATs like my life depended on it. Because to me, it did. I dreamed of attending West Point since I was 12 years old, when Dad first took me to an Army-Navy football game. Watching those cadets march onto the field in perfect formation, their uniforms crisp and their bearing proud, I knew exactly what I wanted to become. An officer. A leader. Someone who serves something bigger than herself. Dad had seemed supportive back then. He helped me research the application requirements, drove me to weekend preparation seminars, even bragged to his Marine buddies about his daughter potentially becoming an Army officer. Different branch, he'd say with a grin, but still a warrior. The application process was brutal. Congressional nominations, physical fitness assessments, medical examinations, leadership evaluations. I threw myself into every requirement with the intensity of someone who'd found her calling. My grades were perfect, my SAT scores in the 99th percentile, my fitness times better than most male applicants. When April arrived, decision notification month, I checked our mailbox obsessively. Every day after school, I'd sprint from the bus stop to our front porch, heart hammering as I flipped through bills and catalogs looking for that distinctive West Point envelope. It never came. Instead, 3 weeks after decisions were supposed to be mailed, Dad sat me down in his study with a solemn expression and a single piece of paper. The letterhead was official, United States Military Academy at West Point. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice heavy with what I thought was genuine sadness. "They said your mathematics scores weren't quite competitive enough for this year's class. But this doesn't mean you can't pursue military service through other paths." I remember staring at that rejection letter, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and crushed my heart. The language was formal but devastating. While your overall application demonstrated exceptional merit, the mathematics component of your academic profile did not meet the standards required for admission to this year's incoming class. Mathematics, I whispered. But I had a 98 average in calculus. I scored 780 on the math SAT. Dad's hand landed on my shoulder with what felt like genuine compassion. "Sometimes these things aren't fair, Aria. The competition is incredibly fierce. Maybe this is God's way of pointing you toward a different path." I cried for 3 days. Then I threw myself into Plan B, ROTC scholarships at civilian universities. Surely my scores would be competitive for those programs. They weren't. One by one, rejection letters arrived. High volume of qualified applicants. Limited funding availability. Encourage you to reapply next year. Each rejection felt like another door slamming shut on my military dreams. I ended up at UC San Diego with an academic scholarship, majoring in international relations and telling myself I could pursue military service after graduation. Dad seemed relieved, Mom was thrilled I'd be staying close to home, and I buried my disappointment under course loads and part-time jobs. It wasn't until I was 25, 7 years later, that I discovered the truth. I was at a military contractors conference in Washington, D.C., networking for my civilian job with a defense consulting firm, when a woman in army dress blues approached my booth. "Excuse me," she said, squinting at my name tag. "Are you Aria Blackwood from San Diego?" "Yes, that's me. I'm Colonel Jennifer Martinez, West Point Admissions. I remember your file from a few years back. How are you enjoying the academy?" My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your West Point application. Class of 2015, right?" I was disappointed when you declined your appointment. Your mathematics scores were some of the highest we'd seen that year. The conference noise faded to white static. Declined my appointment? Colonel Martinez looked confused. Yes, we sent your acceptance letter in March, along with the appointment package. When you didn't respond by the deadline, we assumed you'd chosen a different path. We actually held your spot for an extra week because your congressman called to advocate for you. I felt like I was drowning in broad daylight. Colonel, I never received an acceptance letter. I got a rejection notice saying my math scores weren't competitive. Her face went pale. That's impossible. You were accepted with full honors. Your file is probably still in our system if you'd like me to verify. 2 hours later, sitting in a hotel bar with printouts of my original West Point acceptance letter, I finally understood. The letter was dated March 15th, 3 weeks before Dad had shown me that rejection notice. The acceptance package included dormitory assignments, summer training schedules, and congratulatory notes from both my congressman and the academy superintendent. My father had intercepted my acceptance to West Point, hidden it from me, and forged a rejection letter to destroy my dreams before they could begin. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that he'd then systematically sabotaged my ROTC applications too, probably calling programs to withdraw my applications or sending follow-up letters explaining why I'd changed my mind. He'd orchestrated my military disappointment so thoroughly that I'd never even suspected foul play. I sat in that hotel bar until closing time, staring at the acceptance letter I should have received 9 years earlier, trying to process the magnitude of my father's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen my dream, he'd convinced me I wasn't good enough to achieve it. That night, I made 2 decisions that would change everything. First, I was going to pursue military service no matter how long it took or what obstacles I faced. Second, I was never going to tell my family I'd discovered their deception until I was ready to use that knowledge strategically. Captain Rex Blackwood thought he knew what was best for his daughter. He was about to learn that some dreams are too powerful to kill. They just go underground and grow stronger in the dark. In the days following that disastrous family dinner, my phone rang constantly. Not with calls of support or encouragement, but with what I came to recognize as carefully orchestrated interventions. Uncle Tom called first, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. "Aria, your father asked me to reach out. He's worried about you, sweetheart. He thinks you might be going through some kind of crisis." Crisis. That was the word they'd chosen. Next came my cousin Lisa, who'd always been more like a sister than a cousin. "I know Uncle Rex came down hard on you at dinner, but he's just scared. You know how military families worry about their kids deploying. He lost 2 buddies in Afghanistan, and I think he's projecting." Then Mom's sister, Aunt Catherine, with her gentle counselor voice. "Honey, have you considered that maybe this military thing is your way of seeking approval from your father? Sometimes we pursue dangerous paths when we're trying to prove something to the people we love." One by one, they called. Extended family, family friends, even my high school guidance counselor somehow got my number. The message was always the same, just wrapped in different packaging. Aria was having some kind of breakdown, making irrational decisions, putting herself in danger for psychological reasons they could all clearly see, but I was too delusional to recognize. The narrative was brilliant in its simplicity. Dad wasn't the bad guy for publicly humiliating his daughter and betting against her dreams. He was the concerned father trying to save his mentally unstable child from herself. I started paying attention to what people were actually saying, and the pattern became clear. According to the official Blackwood family story, I was going through a phase as if wanting to serve my country was equivalent to dyeing my hair purple or getting a nose piercing. Seeking attention because apparently the only reason a woman would want to join elite special forces was to get people to notice her. Rebelling against family expectations, which was particularly rich coming from a family whose expectations included hiding acceptance letters and sabotaging scholarship applications. Mentally fragile after some recent disappointments, code for the relationship that had ended 6 months earlier, as if heartbreak had scrambled my brain so badly I thought I could become a Navy SEAL. But the masterstroke was the narrative Dad spun for his military buddies at the yacht club and VFW meetings. He positioned himself as the experienced warrior protecting his naive daughter from the harsh realities of military life. You know how it is, I heard him tell Colonel Peterson at my cousin's wedding. Kids today think military service is like the movies. All glory and heroism. They don't understand the sacrifice, the trauma, the way it breaks people down. I've seen too many good soldiers come home in pieces, physically and mentally. Colonel Peterson nodded sagely. Smart of you to discourage her, Rex. The new integrated training programs are just political theater anyway. They're setting these girls up to fail, and the real soldiers will pay the price when missions go sideways. Exactly, Dad replied, his voice heavy with paternal wisdom. I'd rather have my daughter hate me for protecting her than attend her funeral because I was too proud to speak up. It was masterful manipulation. He'd taken his control issues, his gender bias, and his need to dominate every aspect of my life, and repackaged them as parental love and military wisdom. Anyone who questioned his methods looked heartless. Anyone who supported my dreams was encouraging a mentally unstable young woman to pursue a path that would obviously destroy her. The narrative spread through our military community like wildfire. At barbecues and base events, people looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. Poor Aria Blackwood, having some kind of crisis, making dangerous decisions because she couldn't cope with civilian disappointments. Mom played her part perfectly, sharing just enough concern about my mental state to seem like a worried mother rather than an enabler. She'd sigh and say things like, I just don't know where this is coming from. She's always been such a sensible girl. The beauty of their narrative was that it made my silence look like confirmation. When I stopped arguing with them, stopped attending family events, stopped defending my decision, they interpreted it as proof that I knew they were right. Obviously, I was too embarrassed to admit I'd made a mistake, or too stubborn to back down publicly. She'll come around, Dad told Uncle Tom at my grandmother's birthday party, loud enough for everyone to hear. Once reality hits and she realizes what she's gotten herself into, she'll be grateful we tried to warn her. Sometimes love means saying the hard things, even when it makes you the bad guy. The most insidious part was how they made my dreams sound selfish. According to Dad's version of events, my desire to serve my country was really about ego, attention-seeking, and psychological instability. My willingness to face danger was reckless rather than brave. My determination was stubbornness, my preparation was obsession, and my silence was shame. They'd turned my greatest strength, my unwavering commitment to military service, into evidence of my greatest weakness, an inability to accept reality and make rational decisions. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their narrative construction. They'd assumed I would fail, retreat, and eventually validate their story by giving up and admitting they'd been right all along. Their entire propaganda campaign was built on the foundation of my inevitable defeat. What they didn't anticipate was that I might succeed beyond their wildest imagination, turning their protective narrative into a devastating indictment of their own judgment and character. They'd painted themselves as the wise adults saving a foolish child from herself. When that child grew up to outrank most of them and command the respect they'd spent decades earning, their wise protection would look a lot more like sabotage, and their parental concern would reveal itself as something much darker. I let them build their narrative, brick by brick, never suspecting that every word they spoke in protection of me was actually building the foundation of their own eventual humiliation. The morning after my cousin's wedding, where I'd overheard Dad's "protecting my daughter" speech to Colonel Peterson, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done defending myself. Done explaining my choices. Done giving them ammunition to use against me. I was going completely silent. It started small. When Mom called that Tuesday to check in and fish for information about my SEAL preparation, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was classic Elena Blackwood. Hi, sweetheart. Just wanted to see how you're doing. Dad and I are worried about you. Call me back when you get a chance. I deleted it without responding. When Uncle Tom texted asking if I wanted to grab coffee and talk things through, I read it and put my phone away. When Aunt Catherine sent a Facebook message about family healing, I archived it without opening it. When my cousin Marcus called 3 times in one evening, I turned my phone off. The silence felt powerful. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I wasn't defending myself against their accusations or trying to prove my sanity to people who'd already decided I was unstable. I was simply removing myself from their narrative entirely. But I wasn't just withdrawing, I was strategically disappearing. I unfriended every family member on social media except my youngest cousin Emma, who barely used Facebook anyway. I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to friends and military contacts. I moved out of my apartment near the family and found a place closer to the base where I was doing my pre-training conditioning. When family friends saw me around San Diego, I was polite but brief. "How's the military thing going?" they'd ask, clearly fishing for signs of failure or doubt. "Fine," I'd say with a smile, then change the subject or excuse myself. The lack of information drove them crazy. Without my reactions to fuel their narrative, they had to start making assumptions. And assumptions, I was learning, could be very dangerous things. Mom started calling my old number obsessively, leaving increasingly frantic messages that I only heard about later from friends who'd been asked to check on me. "We haven't heard from Aria in 6 weeks. She's not returning calls. We're starting to worry she might be having some kind of breakdown." Dad took a different approach. He started telling people I'd probably already quit SEAL training but was too embarrassed to tell the family. "You know how pride works," he'd say with that knowing shake of his head. "She'll come around when she's ready to admit she was wrong." The beauty of my silence was that it let them fill in the blanks however they wanted, and they consistently chose to fill them in ways that made them look prophetic and wise. Every week I didn't call was interpreted as evidence that I was either failing miserably or had already failed and was too ashamed to admit it. 6 months passed, then 12, then 18. During that time, I threw myself into preparation with the intensity of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. I trained with former SEALs who ran conditioning programs for candidates. I studied every manual, watched every documentary, talked to every active duty operator who was willing to share insights. I also started documenting everything. Screenshots of Dad's social media posts where he'd joke about certain family members who think they're tougher than they are. Recordings of voicemails where he'd laugh about my inevitable failure. Notes about conversations where family members had repeated his predictions about my mental breakdown or physical inability to handle training. I was building a case, though I didn't fully understand what kind of case yet. Meanwhile, the family narrative evolved to accommodate my extended absence. I wasn't just failing, I was having a complete psychological break. I wasn't just physically inadequate for SEAL training, I was so mentally unstable that I'd cut off all contact with people who loved me. She hasn't spoken to her own mother in over a year. I heard through mutual friends that Mom was telling people. "We're worried sick, but what can you do? You can't help someone who won't admit they need help." Dad's version was more dramatic. The military broke her down so completely that she can't face the people who tried to warn her. It's heartbreaking, really. We knew this would happen, but sometimes you have to let people make their own mistakes. They'd moved from predicting my failure to explaining my disappearance as evidence that failure had already occurred. In their minds, my silence wasn't strategic, it was the behavior of someone who'd been crushed by reality and couldn't bear to admit it. What they didn't know was that their 18 months of assumptions and narrative building were being carefully documented by someone who was not only surviving her training, but excelling at it. Someone who was building relationships with instructors, earning commendations, and gaining the respect of peers who'd initially been skeptical about women in special operations. Someone who was not broken, not ashamed, and not remotely interested in explaining herself to people who'd bet against her success. The silence wasn't just powerful, it was strategic. Every month they spent assuming I'd failed was another month I spent succeeding. Every story they told about my breakdown was another story that would make them look foolish when the truth eventually emerged. I wasn't hiding from their judgment. I was letting them judge a ghost while the real me built something they couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe until they saw it with their own eyes. The longer I stayed silent, the more confident they became in their narrative. And the more confident they became, the more spectacular their eventual reckoning would be. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. Let people fill the silence with their own assumptions, fears, and biases. Let them build their certainty on a foundation of ignorance. Then, when you're ready, show them exactly how wrong they were about everything. While my family spent 18 months crafting stories about my failure and breakdown, I was building something they couldn't imagine, a comprehensive record of everything they'd said, done, and assumed. Not out of spite, but out of strategy. I'd learned the hard way that in wars against powerful people, you need more than the truth, you need proof. My apartment near Coronado Base became a documentation center. I set up a filing system that would have impressed any military intelligence officer. Physical folders, digital backups, cloud storage, and hard copies of everything that mattered. If someone tried to gaslight me about what had really happened, I'd have receipts. The West Point folder came first. After my discovery in Washington, D.C., I'd requested my completed missions file through Freedom of Information Act requests. The real acceptance letter, the congressional recommendation, the academic evaluations, all dated 3 weeks before Dad's forged rejection notice. I had postal tracking records showing when the real letter was delivered to our house, and I'd even tracked down the original envelope in Dad's home office during a brief visit to grab some belongings. He'd kept it, hidden in his desk drawer like some kind of trophy, the West Point acceptance letter that was supposed to change my life. I photographed it in place, then made copies of everything before he knew I'd found it. The SEAL training documentation started small, but grew into something substantial. Every fitness milestone, every academic test, every instructor evaluation. I wasn't just passing their requirements, I was crushing them. Top 5% in physical fitness, highest scores on tactical knowledge exams, leadership ratings that had instructors taking notice. But the real goldmine was my family's own words. Dad's social media was a treasure trove of dismissive comments about women in combat, jokes about certain family members who think they're tougher than they are, and posts where he'd share articles about military training injuries with captions like, "This is why fathers worry." I screenshot everything, complete with timestamps and engagement metrics showing how many people liked and shared his mockery. Mom's Facebook posts were more subtle, but equally damaging. Vague requests for prayers for family members going through difficult times, shares of articles about mental health resources for young adults, and carefully worded updates about being estranged from someone we love who's making dangerous choices. The voicemails were the most revealing. Dad's messages evolved from concern to condescending to almost gleeful as months passed without contact. "Still waiting for that call admitting I was right," he'd say in one message. "Pride comes before the fall, sweetheart, and you're about to learn that lesson the hard way." I recorded conversations too. Family friends who called to check on me, always ending up repeating Dad's theories about my mental state or inevitable failure. Uncle Tom's particularly brutal assessment that I was having some kind of breakdown because I couldn't handle being ordinary. Aunt Catherine's amateur psychology about how I was acting out because of daddy issues. But the most valuable documentation came from my military performance. Instructor recommendations that described my exceptional resilience and tactical thinking. Peer evaluations from male teammates who'd initially doubted women in special operations, but now wrote things like, "Blackwood consistently outperforms expectations and demonstrates leadership qualities that inspire confidence in high-stress situations." Commander Morrison, my primary instructor, had started keeping detailed records of my progress after learning about my family situation. "Aria," he told me one day after a particularly brutal training exercise, "I've never seen someone use family doubt as motivation the way you do. Most people crumble under that kind of pressure. You seem to thrive on it." I asked him to document that observation officially. By the end of my second year, I had 3 storage boxes full of evidence telling 2 completely different stories. My family's version: unstable daughter makes irrational decision, fails predictably, becomes too ashamed to face reality. The military's version: exceptional candidate overcomes adversity, demonstrates leadership potential, earns respect through performance rather than politics. The contrast was so stark it was almost funny. While Dad was telling people I'd probably already washed out and was too embarrassed to admit it, my instructors were recommending me for advanced leadership tracks and specialized training programs. While Mom was asking for prayers for my mental health struggles, I was earning commendations for tactical innovation and team leadership under pressure. While extended family whispered about my breakdown, I was building relationships with some of the most elite warriors in the world, people who'd chosen me for their teams based solely on competence and character. I wasn't just collecting evidence of their wrong predictions, I was building proof of extraordinary success that would make their assumptions look not just incorrect, but absurdly, embarrassingly wrong. The receipts weren't just about defending myself anymore. They were about demonstrating that every single thing my family had said about my capabilities, my mental state, and my future had been the exact opposite of reality. When the time came to reveal the truth, I wouldn't just be proving them wrong. I'd be showing them exactly how wrong, with documentation so comprehensive they couldn't deny, minimize, or rewrite a single detail. The evidence file wasn't just my insurance policy. It was going to be their reckoning. The first person to see through my family's narrative wasn't someone I'd expected. Commander Jake Morrison was a legend in naval special warfare, 22 years of service, 3 Purple Hearts, and a reputation for breaking candidates who thought they were tougher than they actually were. He was exactly the kind of old-school warrior who should have agreed with my father's assessment of women in special operations. Instead, he became the mentor I'd never had and the father figure I'd always needed. It started during Hell Week, when most candidates were running on pure adrenaline and spite. I'd been awake for 4 days, soaked to the bone, muscles screaming from carrying boat hulls and logs that weighed more than I did. During a brief rest period, Morrison pulled me aside. "Blackwood, where's your family?" His question was direct, no nonsense, the way he asked everything. "Sir, they're not involved in my training, sir." "That's not what I asked." His gray eyes studied my face like he was reading classified intelligence. "Most candidates have people calling, visiting, sending care packages. You've been here 8 months and you've never had a single visitor. No emergency contacts except for a college roommate in Seattle. Why?" I could have lied. Could have said my family lived too far away, or that we'd agreed to minimal contact during training. But something about Morrison's directness demanded honesty. "Sir, my family doesn't support my being here. They think I'll fail, and they've made that very clear." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, watching other candidates struggle through surf torture in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, but somehow more intense. "My daughter wanted to be a Marine. Smart as hell, tough as nails, everything you'd want in a warrior." He paused, jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. "I talked her out of it. Said the infantry was no place for girls, that she should find something safer, more appropriate. You know what she did instead?" "No, sir." "Became a teacher. Deployed to Afghanistan with a civilian education program because she still wanted to serve, just not in the way that would disappoint her old man." His voice cracked almost imperceptibly. "IED got her convoy on the way to a girls' school outside Kandahar. 26 years old." The weight of his confession hit me like a physical blow. I understood now why he watched me so carefully, why he pushed me harder than other candidates, why he never let me quit even when everything in my body screamed for surrender. "Sir, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be better." He stood up, back to his commanding posture. "Every time you want to quit, every time someone tells you that you don't belong here, remember that courage doesn't care about your chromosomes. And remember that some of us old-timers are smart enough to learn from our mistakes." From that day forward, Morrison became my unofficial advocate. He documented every achievement, every breakthrough, every moment when I exceeded expectations. When other instructors questioned whether I could handle certain assignments, Morrison would quietly point to my performance metrics. When candidates from traditional military families got discouraged, he'd tell them about the woman who was succeeding without any family support at all. But Morrison did something even more important than advocacy. He connected me with Admiral Patricia Hayes, the Navy's first female admiral in naval special warfare. Admiral Hayes had fought battles I couldn't imagine, breaking barriers while maintaining the respect of peers who'd initially seen her as an experiment rather than an officer. "Commander Morrison tells me you're dealing with some family resistance," Admiral Hayes said during our first meeting. Her office overlooked the Pacific, walls covered with commendations and photos with presidents, foreign dignitaries, and legendary military leaders. Yes, ma'am. They don't think women belong in special operations. Neither did I, initially. Her admission surprised me. I thought I had to prove that women could do everything exactly like men. Took me years to realize that wasn't the point. The point is proving that the mission comes first, and that competence trumps everything else. Admiral Hayes began taking personal interest in my progress, reviewing my training reports and offering guidance that went far beyond military tactics. She taught me about institutional politics, about building alliances, about the difference between breaking barriers and shattering ceilings. Your family's opposition isn't your weakness, Blackwood, she told me after I'd completed advanced training. It's your superpower. Most people need external validation to succeed. You've learned to generate your own fuel from doubt and dismissal. That's a rare skill in leadership. Between Morrison's advocacy and Admiral Hayes's mentorship, I gained something my family had never provided: unconditional belief in my capabilities. These weren't people trying to protect me from failure. They were warriors betting on my success and giving me the tools to achieve it. They saw what my family couldn't or wouldn't see. That my determination to prove them wrong had forged me into exactly the kind of leader the military needed. 2.5 years after walking out of that family dinner, I stood in Admiral Hayes's office holding a package that would detonate my family's carefully constructed narrative like a precision-guided missile. The official Navy photograph in my hands showed me in dress blues, flanked by Admiral Hayes and Commander Morrison, receiving my promotion to Lieutenant Commander, the youngest woman ever to achieve that rank in naval special warfare. You sure about this approach, Blackwood? Admiral Hayes asked, studying the photo that would soon shatter years of family assumptions. Sometimes direct confrontation is more satisfying than psychological warfare. Ma'am, they spent 2 years telling everyone I was too mentally unstable to face them after my inevitable failure. I think it's time they learned what actual failure looks like. I'd chosen the photograph carefully. Not just any promotion photo would do. This one captured everything my father had claimed was impossible. My chest displayed the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, the Combat Action Ribbon, and 3 other commendations I'd earned during classified operations I couldn't discuss, but Dad's military friends would recognize immediately. The timing was perfect. That afternoon, Dad was hosting his monthly yacht club gathering, 30 former Marines and their wives, along with various military contractors and defense industry executives. Uncle Tom had mentioned it in a voicemail he'd left 6 months earlier, back when he was still trying to maintain family connections. I knew Dad would be in full performance mode, regaling his audience with war stories and opinions about the current state of military affairs. I also knew that by 4 p.m., he'd be 3 drinks in and feeling invincible, the perfect moment for his worldview to be completely destroyed. The package was elegant in its simplicity. The 8x10 promotion photograph, professionally printed and matted. A single sheet of naval special warfare letterhead with my current assignment details, nothing classified, just enough to show I wasn't washing dishes at some administrative desk. And a handwritten note on my personal stationery. Dad, the Navy didn't kick me out. They promoted me. Twice. I thought you should know before you lose that bet. Lieutenant Commander Aria Blackwood, Naval Special Warfare Command. I hand-delivered it to the yacht club, walking up to the hostess station in my civilian clothes like I was dropping off a forgotten wallet. Could you please give this to Captain Blackwood? It's from his daughter. He's been waiting for this. The hostess smiled warmly. Of course, honey. He talks about you all the time. So proud of his military daughter. If only she knew. I drove to a coffee shop across the harbor where I could see the yacht club's outdoor deck through binoculars. Dad's group was exactly where I'd expected. Round table near the railing, commanding the best view of the water. I could see him gesturing animatedly, probably in the middle of another story about training recruits or the superiority of Marine Corps standards. At 4:17 p.m., the hostess approached their table with my package. Through the binoculars, I watched Dad's face as he opened it. First confusion, he'd obviously forgotten what his own daughter looked like after 2 years of silence. Then recognition as his brain processed the uniform, the setting, the impossible reality of what he was seeing. The photograph slipped from his hands and fluttered onto the table where Uncle Tom picked it up. I could see Tom's mouth moving rapidly as he read the note aloud to the group. Every head at the table turned toward the photo, then toward Dad, then back to the photo. Dad sat perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Shock. Disbelief. Something that might have been fear. Then he exploded. Even from across the harbor, I could see him standing up so fast his chair tipped backward. His voice carried across the water, though I couldn't make out words. The universal body language of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered was clear enough. Other yacht club members began approaching the table, drawn by the commotion. I watched as the photograph was passed from hand to hand, each person studying it with increasing amazement. These were military people. They knew what those ribbons meant, what that promotion represented, what it took to achieve lieutenant commander rank in naval special warfare. Uncle Tom was on his phone, probably trying to verify that the photo was real. Another man, I recognized Colonel Peterson, was examining the letterhead like he was authenticating classified documents. The women at the table were whispering among themselves, casting glances at Dad that ranged from confused to accusatory. Within 15 minutes, the entire yacht club was buzzing. Staff members were discreetly approaching tables, guests were pulling out phones to Google my name, and Dad was having what appeared to be a very heated conversation with someone on his cell phone. By 5 p.m., 3 people had left the gathering early. By 5:30, Dad was standing alone on the deck while Mom frantically tried to manage the social fallout inside. The beautiful thing about the truth is that it doesn't require explanation or defense. The photograph spoke for itself in a language every person at that yacht club understood fluently. Military achievement, institutional recognition, professional success, everything Dad had spent 2 years claiming was impossible for his mentally unstable daughter. I packed up my binoculars and drove home, knowing that by tomorrow morning, every military family in San Diego would know that Captain Rex Blackwood had been spectacularly, publicly wrong about his own daughter's capabilities. The confrontation was complete, and I hadn't said a single word beyond that note. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are simple truth and perfect timing. Dad had spent 2 years telling everyone I was too ashamed to face reality. Now he was the one who couldn't face his friends, his community, or the undeniable evidence that his parental wisdom was actually ignorant prejudice wrapped in military authority. The bet he'd made so confidently was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Within 48 hours of the yacht club incident, my phone started ringing. Not from family members, they were still too shocked to process what had happened, but from people I barely knew who suddenly wanted to connect with the local military success story. The first call came from Captain Jennifer Walsh, commander of the local Navy Women's Leadership Council. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood? I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. The whole base is talking about your promotion, and we'd love to have you speak at our next event. The second call was from a journalist at the San Diego Union Tribune. We're doing a feature on breaking barriers in military service. Your story is exactly what our readers need to hear. The third call was from Colonel Peterson, the same man who'd told my father at my cousin's wedding that discouraging me was smart and that integrated training programs were just political theater. Aria, this is Colonel Peterson. I wanted to personally apologize for some comments I made to your father a few years back. I was clearly misinformed about your capabilities and the quality of current special warfare training. That's when I realized the institutional shift wasn't just beginning, it was already complete. The military community in San Diego operates like a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. Dad's public humiliation at the yacht club had created ripple effects that spread through bases, VFW halls, and Marine Corps League meetings like wildfire. Within 72 hours, 3 different versions of the story were circulating, but they all had the same basic elements. Rex Blackwood had spectacularly misjudged his own daughter's potential. The most damaging version came from Colonel Peterson himself, who apparently felt compelled to share his conversation with Dad at my cousin's wedding. He told people about agreeing that women in special operations were political theater, about supporting Dad's decision to oppose my military service, about believing that I would become a casualty statistic. Now that Colonel Peterson was looking at a woman who'd not only survived special operations training, but excelled beyond most of her male peers, his previous opinions looked embarrassingly outdated. And since he'd voiced those opinions publicly while supporting Dad's position, his credibility was tied to Dad's judgment. You know what the really embarrassing part is? I overheard Colonel Peterson telling someone at the commissary. Rex was so confident she'd fail that he'd bet his life savings. $2.3 million. Can you imagine being that wrong about your own daughter? The bet had become the most talked about story in military circles. People weren't just discussing my success, they were marveling at Dad's spectacular failure of judgment. The man who'd positioned himself as the wise military patriarch protecting his naive daughter was now the cautionary tale about making assumptions based on prejudice rather than evidence. Uncle Tom tried damage control by calling mutual friends to clarify what had happened. But his explanations only made things worse. Rex was just trying to protect her, he'd say. He didn't know she was actually capable of this level of achievement. The problem with Uncle Tom's spin was that it made Dad look even more foolish. If your job as a father is to recognize and support your child's potential, then completely misjudging that potential isn't protective, it's negligent. Mom faced different, but equally devastating social consequences. The wives of Dad's military friends, women she'd socialized with for decades, began treating her with a mixture of pity and judgment. At base events and military spouse gatherings, conversations would stop when she entered rooms. Not out of respect, but out of awkwardness. I heard Elena's daughter is doing incredibly well in the Navy, someone would say, loud enough for Mom to hear. Such a shame about all that family drama. I can't imagine not supporting my child's military service. The military spouse community has its own brutal social dynamics, and Mom had violated one of the cardinal rules. You support your military children unconditionally, publicly, and proudly. Her 2 years of requesting prayers for my mental health struggles now looked like betrayal rather than maternal concern. But the most devastating shift happened among Dad's Marine Corps buddies. These men had spent 2 years listening to his predictions about my inevitable failure, his jokes about women in combat, his confident assertions about superior parental judgment. Now they were looking at evidence that he'd been wrong about everything. Rex always was too rigid in his thinking. I heard through mutual friends that Sergeant Major Rodriguez had said, "Good Marine, but maybe not the best judge of potential in others." That comment from Rodriguez, a man Dad had served with in Afghanistan and considered one of his closest friends, represented the complete collapse of his military credibility. When your peers start questioning your judgment publicly, your reputation becomes irreparable. The shift wasn't just personal. It was institutional. The local military community that had once seen Dad as a respected voice of experience now saw him as an example of how prejudice could cloud professional judgment. His opinions about military matters, previously sought after and respected, were now viewed with skepticism. The truth had done what years of argument never could have accomplished. It had turned Dad's own community against his narrative and made him the subject of the kind of military gossip that follows you everywhere and never really goes away. 3 weeks after the Yacht Club revelation, I was sitting in Admiral Hayes's office when she dropped a file on her desk that made my heart skip. The tab read Civilian Vessel Requisition Authority in official Navy letterhead. Tell me about your father's yacht, Blackwood. I'd never mentioned the yacht to Admiral Hayes, which meant she'd been doing her own research into my family situation. Ma'am, it's an 80-foot Sunseeker named Semper Fi. He bought it with his military retirement and contracting income. It's his most prized possession. Registered where? San Diego Harbor, Shelter Island Marina. Admiral Hayes opened the file and began reading with the careful attention she usually reserved for operational briefings. Your father made some interesting public statements about your military service. I've been hearing about them through various channels. She pulled out a printed screenshot of one of Dad's Facebook posts from 18 months earlier. One of my documented pieces of evidence, apparently now in official Navy files. The post showed a news article about a female soldier injured in training, with Dad's comment, "This is why fathers have to be the voice of reason. Some dreams are just too dangerous for reality." Ma'am, how did you? The military community is smaller than people think, Lieutenant Commander. When a decorated Marine publicly bets against his daughter's success in naval special warfare, it gets attention. Especially when that daughter becomes one of our most promising officers. Admiral Hayes closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "I have authority to requisition civilian vessels for training exercises. Real-world scenarios require real-world assets, and sometimes that means commandeering private boats, vehicles, or equipment for the greater good of military readiness." I felt my pulse quicken as I understood where this was heading. The Semper Fi fits our specifications for an upcoming training exercise. We need a luxury yacht approximately that size for a high-value target extraction scenario. The exercise is scheduled for next month, coincidentally around your father's birthday. She slid a requisition form across the desk. All the details were filled in except for one signature line, "Authorizing Officer." "This is your call, Blackwood. You have the authority to sign this requisition." The yacht would become government property for the duration of the exercise, and given the nature of the training, which involves simulated combat scenarios, there's a significant possibility the vessel would be damaged beyond repair. I stared at the form, understanding the full implications. Dad's yacht wasn't just his hobby, it was his identity. The floating symbol of his success, his retirement dream, his escape from the realities of aging and irrelevance. Taking it away wouldn't just cost him money, it would destroy the last vestige of his authority and control. "Ma'am, what happens if I don't sign this?" Then we requisition a different yacht from someone who hasn't spent 2 years publicly mocking naval special warfare's judgment. Admiral Hayes' expression was neutral, but her meaning was crystal clear. Your father chose to make his opinion of our training standards a matter of public record. Now he gets to contribute directly to the training he claimed was ineffective. I picked up the pen, thinking about all the times Dad had used his military authority to control my choices. How he'd hidden my West Point acceptance because he knew better. How he'd sabotaged my ROTC applications because he was protecting me. How he'd publicly bet against my success because his experience trumped my potential. Now I had authority he'd never possessed, rank he'd never achieved, and respect he'd never earned from the people who mattered most in military circles. I signed the requisition with steady hands, authorizing the seizure of my father's most prized possession for naval special warfare training exercises and potential target practice scenarios. The power reversal was complete. The daughter he dismissed as mentally unstable now outranked him institutionally and had the authority to take everything he valued most. "Excellent," Admiral Hayes said, filing the requisition in her outgoing mail. "The Coast Guard will handle the actual seizure. Should be quite a birthday surprise." The morning after signing the yacht requisition, I stood in my apartment looking at 3 generations of Blackwood military service photos arranged on my kitchen table. Grandpa Blackwood in his World War II Army uniform. Dad in his Marine dress blues from the 1980s. Uncle Tom's Navy portrait from his submarine service. And now, my own promotion photograph in Naval Special Warfare dress uniform. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at these photos as reminders of a legacy I could never match. I was looking at them as stepping stones I'd already surpassed. Dad had spent my entire childhood telling stories about Grandpa's service in the Pacific Theater, how he'd earned 2 Bronze Stars and helped liberate the Philippines. Real warriors, he'd say, who understood what sacrifice meant. The implication was always clear. Modern military service, especially mine, could never measure up to the greatest generation's heroism. But I'd done my research. Grandpa's military records, which I'd obtained through the National Archives, told a different story than Dad's mythology. Grandpa had been a supply sergeant who'd earned his Bronze Stars for logistical excellence under fire, important work, but hardly the frontline combat heroics Dad had described. He'd served 18 months in the Pacific, all of it in support roles on secured bases. Uncle Tom's submarine service was similarly embellished in family lore. Dad talked about Tom's deep-sea missions and classified operations like he'd been hunting Soviet nuclear subs during the Cold War. The reality was 6 years of routine patrols and training exercises, with his most dangerous assignment being a NATO joint exercise in the North Atlantic. Dad's own service record was impressive but not extraordinary. 3 tours in Afghanistan, solid leadership, respected by his peers, exactly what you'd expect from a career Marine. But nothing that approached the elite-level training and operational complexity I'd achieved in naval special warfare. I was the first Blackwood to serve in special operations. The first to be handpicked for classified missions I couldn't discuss. The first to receive commendations for combat leadership. The first to achieve officer rank through merit rather than time in service. More importantly, I was the first Blackwood to serve despite family opposition rather than because of family support. That realization changed everything about how I saw my place in the family's military lineage. I wasn't the black sheep who'd abandoned tradition. I was the evolution of that tradition. I hadn't dishonored the family legacy. I'd elevated it beyond anything previous generations had achieved. The family had always defined military service through the lens of masculine honor and traditional gender roles. Grandpa served because real men protected their country. Dad served because following family tradition was what sons did. Uncle Tom served because military service was the Blackwood way of proving manhood. I served because I believed in something bigger than myself, and I'd earned my place through pure competence in an environment that owed me nothing and demanded everything. The difference was crucial. Previous Blackwood military service had been about meeting expectations and fulfilling societal roles. My service was about shattering expectations and redefining what was possible. I started writing a letter I'd never planned to send, not to Dad or Mom, but to my future children or men's who might someday struggle with family opposition to their dreams. Military tradition isn't about doing what your family expects, I wrote. It's about serving something greater than personal approval or social comfort. Real tradition isn't preserved by repetition, it's evolved through courage to do what others think is impossible. I thought about the young women who'd approached me after my promotion story hit the news. Girls whose fathers told them combat wasn't for women, whose families worried about their safety, whose communities questioned their motivations. They were looking for proof that family doubt didn't have to become personal limitation. I was that proof. The Blackwood military legacy hadn't ended with my rebellion against family expectations, it had begun. Everything that came before was preparation. Everything that came after would be possibility. Dad had tried to protect a tradition he thought I would disgrace. Instead, I'd created a new tradition that made his protection obsolete. I wasn't carrying forward the Blackwood legacy, I was transforming it into something worthy of the sacrifice it demanded. The photos on my table weren't just family history anymore. They were the beginning of a story that no one had imagined possible, least of all the people who shared my DNA but had never understood my soul. I was no longer Rex Blackwood's disappointing daughter. I was Lieutenant Commander Aria Blackwood, and I'd just become the most distinguished military officer in my family's history. The legacy wasn't something I'd inherited. It was something I'd earned, defended, and redefined entirely on my own terms. After the yacht seizure made headlines across San Diego's military community, my phone exploded with attempts at reconciliation. Text messages, voicemails, emails, and even handwritten letters delivered to my base address. Everyone wanted to be the family member who repaired the relationship with the newly successful daughter. Dad's first attempt came 3 days after his birthday yacht disaster. The voicemail was classic Rex Blackwood, no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a carefully constructed narrative that positioned him as the misunderstood victim. Aria, I think we need to talk. There's been some miscommunication about our family situation, and I want to clear the air. I've always supported your military service, even when I had concerns about your safety. That's what fathers do, we worry. Maybe I could have expressed my concerns differently, but my heart was always in the right place. Call me back. I deleted it without responding. Mom tried a different approach, showing up at the base visitor center with a homemade care package and tears in her eyes. The duty officer called to let me know she was there, requesting a meeting to discuss family matters. Tell her I appreciate the gesture, but I'm unavailable, I told him. Please return the package. Mom waited in the parking lot for 4 hours. I watched her through my office window, sitting in her car, probably crying and checking her phone for texts I wasn't sending. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd been Dad's enabler more than his partner in the campaign against my dreams. But feeling sorry for someone doesn't mean you have to rebuild a relationship that was built on their willingness to sacrifice your happiness for family peace. Uncle Tom's attempts were the most transparent. His messages weren't about repairing relationships, they were about damage control for his own reputation. People are asking questions about our family dynamics, Arya. Maybe we could grab coffee and figure out how to present a united front moving forward. The phrase united front told me everything I needed to know about Uncle Tom's priorities. He wasn't concerned about healing family wounds. He was worried about how the family drama was affecting his standing in the community. His reputation was tied to Dad's, and Dad's spectacular public failure had created guilt by association. I responded to exactly none of it. The beautiful thing about having rebuilt your entire life without family support is that you don't need family approval to maintain it. Every relationship I valued, every professional connection that mattered, every source of personal validation in my life existed completely independent of the people who shared my DNA. I had Commander Morrison, who checked in weekly and celebrated my achievements like a proud father. I had Admiral Hayes, who provided mentorship and guidance that went far beyond military matters. I had Saracen and the other SEALs who'd become my chosen family, people who'd earned their place in my life through loyalty and respect rather than genetic accident. I had a career that fulfilled me, challenges that excited me, and a sense of purpose that no family drama could diminish. I didn't need reconciliation with people who'd spent years undermining my dreams. I needed them to understand that their opinions about my life choices had become completely irrelevant. When extended family members tried to play mediator, I was polite but firm. I appreciate your concern, but this isn't a misunderstanding that needs to be resolved. This is a consequence that needs to be accepted. Cousin Lisa persisted longer than most. Arya, you're being stubborn. Dad made mistakes, but he's still your father. Family is family. Family is people who support your dreams instead of betting against them, I replied. Family is people who celebrate your achievements instead of explaining them away. Family is people who apologize when they're wrong instead of pretending they were misunderstood. The hardest part wasn't rejecting their reconciliation attempts, it was resisting the temptation to gloat. I could have rubbed their faces in my success, demanded public apologies, forced them to admit how wrong they'd been about everything. I could have leveraged my newfound institutional power to make their lives as difficult as they'd made mine. But that would have required caring about their opinions, and I'd moved beyond that months ago. Revenge would have meant I still needed something from them: acknowledgement, apology, validation. The truth was, I didn't need anything from them anymore. Their recognition of my success was nice, but unnecessary. Their regret about their treatment of me was irrelevant to my happiness. I'd built a life so fulfilling and complete that their absence wasn't a loss, it was a relief. The most powerful position isn't needing revenge because you're too busy being successful to waste time on people who don't matter. When someone bets against your dreams and loses spectacularly, you don't need to punish them. Their own poor judgment becomes punishment enough. Dad had lost his yacht, his reputation, and his credibility in military circles. Mom had lost her social standing among military spouses and her relationship with her only child. Uncle Tom was dealing with questions about his own judgment and association with Dad's prejudices. I didn't cause those consequences, I simply succeeded while they revealed their true character through their treatment of my dreams. The best revenge isn't elaborate schemes or dramatic confrontations. The best revenge is building such an amazing life that the people who bet against you become irrelevant to your happiness. 1 year to the day after the yacht seizure, I sat at my desk drafting a package that would provide the final punctuation mark to our family drama. Not because I needed closure, but because perfect timing demanded acknowledgement. The centerpiece was a Navy SEAL Challenge coin from my first successful classified mission, the kind of recognition that most military families would frame and display with pride. It was solid brass, heavy in my palm, engraved with the trident that symbolized everything Dad had claimed I could never achieve. Attached to the coin was a cashier's check for $2,347,000, the exact amount of Dad's life savings bet, plus interest calculated at military lending rates. The money had come from my promotion bonuses, hazard pay from classified operations, and investment returns that exceeded anything Dad's retirement portfolio had ever generated. The note was handwritten on my personal letterhead, Lieutenant Commander Aria Blackwood, Naval Special Warfare Command. Dad, your bet paid off better than you imagined. Thanks for the motivation. The coin is from my first successful mission. Keep it as a reminder that your daughter doesn't quit. Consider this a loan repayment for the opportunities you tried to steal. No interest required. LCDRA, Blackwood. I'd chosen Dad's 61st birthday for delivery because anniversaries matter in military culture. Exactly 1 year after his 60th birthday humiliation, he'd received proof that his daughter had not only survived his opposition, but transformed it into fuel for extraordinary achievement. The mathematical precision was deliberate. He bet $2.3 million that I'd fail. I was returning $2.347 million as proof that his failure of judgment had cost him nothing except his credibility. The extra $47,000 represented what his money could have earned if he'd invested in his daughter's success instead of betting against it. But the challenge coin was the real message. In military culture, challenge coins represent brotherhood, achievement, and recognition from peers who understand what sacrifice means. They're earned through blood, sweat, and proving yourself worthy of respect from people who don't give it easily. Dad had challenge coins from his Marine service displayed in his study. Tokens of accomplishment that he treasured more than any material possession. He understood their significance in ways that civilians couldn't appreciate. Giving him my mission coin wasn't just sharing my achievement, it was demonstrating that I'd surpassed every level of military accomplishment he'd ever reached. The coin represented operations he'd never be cleared to know about, conducted by units that had rejected thousands of applicants who thought they were qualified. It was proof that the daughter he'd dismissed as mentally unstable had earned recognition from the most elite warriors in the world. I packaged everything carefully, using the same delivery service that had brought his yacht seizure notice exactly 1 year earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate. 1 year ago, he lost his most prized possession to his daughter's authority. Today, he'd gained something far more valuable, undeniable proof of her excellence. The gift required no response, demanded no acknowledgement, and expected no gratitude. It was simply the final demonstration that his bet had been the most expensive misjudgment of his life, both financially and emotionally. He'd wagered everything on my failure and lost. I was returning his money because I could afford to be generous, but keeping the satisfaction of knowing that his opinion had been utterly, comprehensively wrong. The challenge coin would sit on his desk as a daily reminder that the daughter he'd tried to control had grown into a woman he could never understand, serving at levels he'd never reached, earning respect he'd never commanded. It was the perfect ending to an imperfect relationship, generous enough to demonstrate my success, symbolic enough to ensure he'd never forget the lesson, and final enough to close the chapter permanently. Some gifts aren't about kindness. Sometimes gifts are about power, precision, and putting the perfect period at the end of a sentence someone else started writing. The challenge coin gift accomplished what years of argument never could. It forced acknowledgement without requiring apology. Within weeks of Dad receiving the package, I began hearing through mutual friends about the coin's permanent residence on his desk, positioned where every visitor could see it. Not hidden away like an embarrassment, but displayed like a trophy he couldn't quite claim. Rex keeps showing people that Navy SEAL coin Colonel Peterson mentioned to a mutual friend who later told me. Says it's from his daughter's first mission. You can tell he's proud, but he's too stubborn to admit he was wrong about everything. Mom's transformation was more subtle, but equally telling. Her Facebook posts began featuring throwback photos of me in high school, accompanied by captions like, "Always knew she was destined for greatness, and so proud of my military daughter." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its completeness. Suddenly she'd always been supportive, always believed in my potential, always known I'd succeed. Uncle Tom took a different approach, quietly distancing himself from Dad's previous positions while never explicitly contradicting them. When people asked about the family drama, he'd say things like, military families sometimes have different perspectives on service, and everything worked out exactly as it should have. The military community's recognition was more direct. I became the success story that proving women belonged in special operations, the poster child for ignoring family doubt and pursuing excellence anyway. Speaking invitations arrived weekly. Military academies wanted me to address their female cadets. Defense contractors offered consulting positions that would have made Dad's business income look like pocket change. But the most meaningful recognition came from the young women who reached out after my story became public. Emails from high school seniors whose fathers discouraged military service. Letters from college students whose families questioned their physical capabilities. Phone calls from women already in the military who face skepticism about pursuing special operations training. Your story gave me permission to disappoint my father in order to serve my country, one 19-year-old wrote. If you can become a SEAL despite family opposition, maybe I can too. That's when I realized my success had become bigger than personal vindication. I wasn't just proving Dad wrong, I was creating possibilities for women whose fathers shared his prejudices. Every achievement expanded the definition of what daughters could accomplish when they stopped seeking permission and started earning respect. I established the Blackwood Foundation for Military Women, using my promotion bonuses and speaking fees to provide scholarships for women pursuing military careers against family opposition. The name was deliberate. Instead of hiding from my family legacy, I was redefining it entirely. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was Sarah Martinez, an 18-year-old from Texas whose Marine father had forbidden her from applying to military academies. Women don't belong in combat, he'd told her, using almost identical language to Dad's old arguments. 6 months later, Sarah was thriving at the Naval Academy, sending me updates about her academic progress and athletic achievements. Her father remained skeptical, but couldn't argue with her success. Another daughter proving another father wrong, expanding possibilities for the next generation. Dad never apologized. Mom never admitted her complicity. Uncle Tom never acknowledged his enabling. But their recognition was evident in how they spoke about me to others, how they displayed my achievements, how they'd quietly adjusted their opinions about women in military service without ever admitting they'd been wrong. I didn't need their apologies because I'd found something better, the ability to transform personal pain into institutional change. Every young woman who pursued military service because my story gave her courage was worth more than 1,000 family apologies. My identity was no longer defined by their expectations or constrained by their limitations. I wasn't Rex Blackwood's disappointing daughter or Elena Blackwood's troubled child. I was Lieutenant Commander Aria Blackwood, and I was building a legacy that would outlast their prejudices and inspire women they'd never meet. Strength doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or loud confrontations. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly, methodically prove that everyone who bet against you was fundamentally wrong about who you are and what you're capable of achieving. My father thought betting his life savings against my success would teach me a lesson about accepting limitations. Instead, it taught me that other people's opinions of your potential, even family members, are just opinions. Reality is what you make it through preparation, persistence, and refusing to let anyone else's doubt become your truth. The most satisfying victories aren't the ones where you destroy your enemies. They're the ones where you build something so extraordinary that your enemies become irrelevant to your happiness. Dad kept that challenge coin on his desk not because he'd learned to respect my choices, but because he finally understood that my success had moved far beyond his ability to influence or understand. When someone bets against your dreams, don't waste energy trying to change their mind. Change your reality instead. Build something so undeniably excellent that their skepticism becomes a footnote in your success story. Sometimes strength leaves quietly, builds brilliantly, and wins so completely that explanation becomes unnecessary. The best response to "you can't do that" isn't argument, it's achievement.